I see the uniqueness in this partnership laid in the structures that have been put in place. Why do I say that? In 2007, this was not the only partnership that was in place. There were 8 other partnerships. But what has made the energy partnership unique, exactly in the beginning, structures were put in place. Steering group members were identified from both Europe and Africa in a way to ensure that there is this mutual discussions. And then in addition to that, the steering group members agreed to have a secretariat to support the political steering structure. And as soon as the wheel started rolling, the steering group members asked the secretariat to ensure that there is an engagement of the non-state actors. Now, if you look at this kind of architecture being put in place, this is unique. And you'd look at other partnerships and you'll realize that this lacked, and this has made the energy one a success. To me, this is unique. For the partnership to be able to achieve the targets that the political leaders, and political leaders here I mean the ministers of responsible for energy in Africa and the ministers responsible for development cooperation and international relations, where energy as a development topic falls in, they put in place targets. And to be able to achieve these targets, you need to engage a wide range of stakeholders. In this case, in particular, the private sector, because it is clear both from the European side and from the African side, the development assistance, the donor funds into African countries will not solve the equation of the energy gap that exists. And bringing in the private sector is kind of a very strong message being sent out. And we've seen this happening within the partnership. But the private sector is one element. There is also the need to have a civil society inclusion into the work of the partnership to keep all the political entities on track in terms of if the targets have been put in place, then they have to be followed up. They have to be, you have to show course of the euro that is being spent on it. And as we've seen this as a very useful element. And then finally, which is often forgotten, is the academia, the research. Because, I mean, if you look at the private sector, for instance, they rely on innovation. They rely on statistics that is generated by the researchers, by the academia. So in combination, this has been kind of an element that we've brought into play into the partnership. But maybe I might just take it a bit further into the public sector. Because initially we have the member states and we have the European Commission and the African Union Commission, but there are other public institutions like in Africa, the regional entities, the regional economic communities, regional power pools, regional centers. These we've also looped in and incorporated into the work of the partnership so that to have this completeness and to ensure that the actors that we're dealing with have what we could say boots on the ground. And this is, let's say, the regional entities, the member states and the actors. In 2010, targets were agreed, very clear targets. 2010 was the baseline that was put on this because the targets were agreed earlier. And in this case, it was clear targets on renewable energy, on energy access, on energy efficiency. Now, once these targets have agreed politically, as a secretariat are supposed to monitor, to follow it up. And what we did was to put in place a methodology on how we can be able to track these numbers. Remember, it's not an easy exercise because it involves so many institutions. Data is a big concern, mainly in Africa. So we have to work with various statistical bodies. But in addition, we realized that working only with public institutions to provide data leading to limitation of the amount of data that we have. We've had to engage, let's say, private data institutions to be able to kind of have a collective information. But at the end of it, you still have to kind of categorize the contributions and the achievements in different levels. And then something that I could also say as a challenge is that some of the initiatives that are happening in Africa could have a European commitment and contribution into it, but then there could be other actors also contributing to the same. So we have to find out a formula of attributing to what extent this is European contribution. To me, this has been, let's say, an exciting aspect. We've achieved that to a large extent. We've had a consistent periodical status report. We are looking forward to release the final one in the context of the AEP 2020 targets in Abidjan, in the sidelines of the Africa-EU summit. And this will be, let's say, a beginning of a new set of targets that the European and the African leaders will again commit to. It's been 10 years of the partnership. Myself, I've had close to 6 years as a head of this partnership. There could be lots of things that come into mind. However, there is one that still rings in my mind. During the G7 under the Italian presidency, that is actually in 2017, I was invited by the Italian Foreign Affairs Minister to be able to address the G7 ministers responsible for energy. That was kind of a nice surprise, an occasion where I felt honored, I felt privileged. But not just me as a person, but the partnership as a whole, because what the G7 members wanted to hear from the partnership, the Africa-EU Energy Partnership, was what is our take, so that the G7 members could ensure that that is looped into the conclusions of the G7 Ministers of Energy. So standing there and speaking to the great 7 ministers was such a memory for me. And in this context, also the message that was spoken for this found its way into the conclusions of the G7 meeting. That is a great memory for me.